I didn't want attention, or prayer, or advice. I just wanted to disappear, hide from everyone, including God. You know, that kind of pain that even crying can't solve. I woke up with it and went to sleep with it. And when I slept, I dreamed about it. No one knew. I smiled on the outside, but inside, I was broken. It was at this stage that I opened the Bible and came across words that seemed to have been written by me. Psalm 102 was not just a psalm. It was my undated journal. It was my unheard cry, each line an open wound. I started reading without any expectations. I just wanted something to tell me I wasn't crazy, that this hole in my chest was real. And it was there, in that verse that I read, "I have mixed my tears with my cup." It stopped me. I looked up at the ceiling. I almost laughed, because that was it. I was drinking coffee with tears, lunch with tears, water with tears. The psalm continued. I am like an owl in the ruins. I read and thought, that's it. I am that owl, alone, in the dark, surrounded by remains. That day I didn't cry reading the Bible. I cried with the Bible, as if it were crying with me. I began to realize that the psalmist wasn't trying to be strong. He wasn't preaching. He wasn't motivating anyone. He was just ... exhausted, just like me. And that set me free, because I was taught that faith was smiling even when you fall, that a true Christian can't show weakness. But there, in that text, I saw someone falling apart without a filter. And God recorded it. He didn't erase it. He didn't censor it. And that made me think, will God allow me to be weak too? Will He listen to those who only have moaning and anger to express? The answer didn't come like a thunderclap, but something in me began to change. It didn't change my situation. Everything was still a mess. But that night was the first time in weeks that I didn't think about giving up. The psalm didn't end on a happy note, but I didn't end that night on a happy note either. It was as if God said, I haven't taken you out of the pain yet, but I'm there with you. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the one I needed. For the first time, I felt that God wasn't waiting for me at the end of the tunnel. He was sitting with me inside it, silent, but present. I closed the Bible and stared at the ceiling. I didn't pray a pretty prayer. I just said, if you're still here, don't let me die like this. I wasn't talking about physical death. I was talking about the soul, the heart, because there are days when we don't want to stop breathing, but we want to stop feeling. And that night, without light, without music, without a prophet, I had the beginning of the greatest answer of my life. An answer that did not come with miracles, but with presence. And sometimes, God's presence is the only miracle we need. The next day, I woke up with that strange feeling of someone who has cried themselves to sleep. My body still hurt. My soul, let alone. The Bible was still open on Psalm 102 on the table. And I asked myself, was yesterday just emotion, or was God really there with me? I was honest. I didn't feel anything supernatural. No voice, no vision, no magical peace, just silence. But it was a silence ... different. A silence that no longer crushed me. It was as if God was still there, silent, but present ... and that, in a weird way, comforted me. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I reread the psalm, line by line, like someone revisiting a forgotten letter. And it was then that a phrase caught my attention again. He has regarded the prayer of the destitute and has not despised their plea. That struck a chord with me, because I thought my prayer wasn't getting through. But what if God doesn't answer the way I expect? And yet He listens. Does He listen to those who no longer have the strength to pray beautifully, just to say, help me? I began to understand that what separated me from God was not my suffering, but my mistaken idea that He only appears when everything improves. But what if He appears when everything falls apart? The truth is that I spent years trying to be too strong, to pray correctly, to speak beautifully, to show faith even when I was broken inside. But that psalm showed me something else. God also listens to those who are broken, those who only moan, those who have no faith-based speech, only tears. And maybe that's why this psalm was written like that, in the most raw way possible, to show that heaven does not close its ears to those who can only cry, "Help." I realized that even in silence, God did not turn away. He saw, He heard, He stayed. And that gave me more hope than any miracle. But the pain was still there. I won't pretend. It wasn't automatic. I still felt a hole inside my chest. I still saw myself as that owl among the ruins. An animal awake in the early hours of the morning, lost, surrounded by memories of a past that will never return. But now I knew I wasn't alone. And that changes everything. Because the worst part of pain isn't feeling it. It's feeling it alone. And in that room, that early morning, between tears and exhaustion, I knew God did not take me out of the valley, but He walked with me into it, and His presence began to reorganize my soul. Slowly. In the days that followed, I began to speak to God in a new way. Not as a servant trying to impress the king, but as a fallen child who just wants to be held. No mask, no theology, just a broken and sincere heart. And I realized that this kind of prayer, even imperfect, touches heaven. Because God does not respond to performance. He responds to truth. And my truth, at that moment, was only pain, loneliness, and a request. Don't let me die inside. And that was when the healing began. Not in the body, nor in the circumstances, but in the spirit, in the soul that no longer saw any sense in continuing. Little by little, little things started to make a difference. A verse here, a conversation there, a song of praise that played in the background and made me cry without knowing why. The world was still the same. The problems were the same, but I wasn't the same anymore. Because now I knew that God doesn't need to respond to be present. And sometimes, just the fact that He hasn't gone away is proof of His love. And it was this silent presence that kept me breathing when everything said I was going to sink once and for all. The pain still spoke loudly. But for the first time, I felt that God listened ... and stayed. The worst lie I believed was this: if God were with me, I wouldn't be like this. It was what drove me the furthest away from Him. Because the pain convinced me that I was invisible. A forgotten mistake. But now, even in the pain, I could no longer deny that there was something ... different. I wasn't healed. I wasn't happy. But something started moving inside me. It wasn't emotion. It was a kind of awareness. A strange perception that God hadn't abandoned me. I just stopped noticing His presence. And that thought made me shiver. Because if that were true, I would have to rethink everything. I began to realize how many times I only sought God when I wanted a solution. But never just to be with Him. The truth is hard. I treated God like an emergency button. And now, when everything was in ruins and He didn't do anything, I began to understand that the greatest miracle was Him still want to hear me. Still stay close. Deep down, it was as if He was waiting for me to get tired of running. And now that I stopped, hurt and exhausted, He didn't charge me anything. He just stayed. And that silent, constant, invisible presence began to heal things that I didn't even know were broken. I won't romanticize it. There were still days when getting out of bed was a struggle. When discouragement would suffocate me even before breakfast. But even those days began to take on a different color. Because now, even when I was tired, I remembered He saw the prayer of the helpless. I was no longer the one who suffered in silence. I was the one who suffered ... being heard. And that changes everything. Because when pain is shared with someone who truly cares, it no longer dominates with the same strength. And that's what Psalm 102 began to do to me. It didn't erase the pain, but it exposed the lie that God ignored me. Interestingly, The more I read this psalm, the more it gave me peace. Even though it was sad, because now I saw that my pain was not an exception. It was part of the journey, and that God's not afraid of our darkness. He enters it. This gave me the freedom to be honest. I began writing my own prayers, similar to the psalm, full of doubt, weakness, and suppressed cries. But each word was sincere, and I knew God received them. Not because they were pretty, but because they came from a naked heart. And I realized that this is the heart He seeks. I had no answers, but I had sincere questions. I had no strength, but I had a thirst for truth. And I realized that God can do much with little, including with a broken heart. What matters is to give Him that little bit. And that's what I started to do. Little by little, my faith began to return. Not the emotional faith of lively religious services, but a mature faith, painful, real, one that is born from the mud, that survives the silence, and that recognizes God even when there are no visible miracles. A faith that springs from the bottom of the valley, like a flower that insists on growing among dry stones. I still felt like the owl in the middle of the ruins. But now I knew that God was there, among the rubble, watching me with love. And if He was there, maybe those ruins weren't the end of me. Maybe they were the place where He would start something new. I didn't know how yet, or when, but you knew I wasn't alone. And that alone was more than I'd had in a long time. For the first time, the idea of living another day no longer terrified me, because now I carried His presence within me. Silent, steady, and absolutely real. That's when life decided to test me again. And it wasn't with something small. One piece of bad news after another. A connection that knocked me off my feet. Problems that seemed to come all at once, as if hell had written my name on a piece of paper. That this time it was different. I trembled, of course. I cried too. But I didn't collapse, because something inside me was already firmer. Not because I became strong, but because I learned where to lean on when everything falls apart. And that made all the difference. I knew where to run. And that was half the battle to not going crazy. I went back to Psalm 102. I was already reading it as if I were reading a friend, a witness to my own chaos. And the more I read, the more I realized how God was never absent from the text. He seemed absent, but He was there all the time, being mentioned, cried out to, and pleaded with. The psalmist said, "But you, Lord, will remain forever." That broke me, because that was it. Everything around me was unstable, unpredictable, cruel. But He remains. God remains even when everything in me falls apart. And it was in His presence that I began to rebuild mine. I began to realize that my old faith was based on good times. When everything was going well, I prayed, gave thanks, smiled. But in pain, I sank. Now it was the opposite. In pain, I held on, because it was in pain that God revealed Himself most present. Pain became the meeting place. And this is not easy to explain. But it is real. I no longer sought God to free me from pain. I sought Him so that He would not leave me alone in it. And this became my routine. Difficult days, broken prayers, faith rebuilt word by word. There were days when all I could say was, "I'm still here." And I was sure that God would answer, "Me too." Not with words, but with a kind of comfort that can't be faked. It was as if His presence held me in the midst of the chaos, even without taking me out of it. And that was enough, because the greatest victory of faith is not escaping pain. It is not getting lost in it. And now, even with life screaming, I no longer felt buried. God was with me, and where He is, even the darkest valley begins to make sense. People around me started to notice. "You look different. You seem lighter, even going through all this." I just smiled, because I knew it was true. The pain was still there, but it no longer ruled me. Something inside me had been restored. Not on the outside, not in the facts, but in the soul. And that's what sustains someone in the midst of a storm. Because when the soul is restored, the world may be falling apart, and yet you remain standing. And that's exactly what started happening to me. What struck me was that it all began with a forgotten psalm. A psalm that no one reads in Sunday services. A heavy text, full of laments that seemed more like a rant than a prayer. But it was there that I found the purest faith of my life. The faith of someone who has lost everything, except the hope that God still listens. The faith of someone who doesn't need to see to believe. Of someone who doesn't need to understand to trust. And this faith, even though hurt, is alive. And alive, it began to rekindle everything inside me. It was strange to realize that the pain was still there, but it no longer controlled my routine. It did appear, yes, but now it was a visitor, no longer a resident. And I began to make peace with the fact that maybe some wounds never go away completely. But that's okay. A healing wound still hurts a little, but it no longer bleeds. And that's how I felt. Still sensitive, still vulnerable, but standing. And firm. Not because I had become strong, but because I had discovered where the rock was. And I wasn't going to let go anymore. My days were back to normal. Small joys began to appear again. A hot coffee that comforted me. A sunset that moved me. A simple verse that touched me like a hug. And it was in this daily routine that God began to show himself more present than ever. Not with scandalous miracles, but with delicate, constant, real signs. Because God also speaks in silence, in routine, in detail. And those who have gone through pain learn to see beauty even in things they previously ignored. Because now everything tastes like a miracle. Even breathing. I didn't have all the answers, but I didn't need them anymore. What I did have was certainty, that God had been with me the whole time. And that was worth more than any explanation. I began to read Psalm 102 with different eyes. It still moved me, but now with gratitude. Because I understood that that lament was also a prayer that had been heard. And if God recorded that cry of pain in the Bible, it is because he wants us to know. Even the saddest cries have a place before him. He doesn't despise the broken. He embraces them. And that's what changed everything. I started telling other people who suffered in silence, people who thought that God only listens to pretty prayers. And I said, he heard mine, which was just a moan. And I saw tears and tired eyes. Because no one wants advice when they are in ruins. They want support. They want presence. They want truth. And that is what I started to offer. Not as someone who overcame everything, but as someone who survived with faith. And now he knows where the source is that does not dry up even in deserts. This has become my new ministry. Being real with those who bleed in silence. And little by little, I realized that the promise at the end of Psalm 102 was being fulfilled. The Lord will rebuild Zion. That hit me like an arrow. Because Zion is me too. It's you too. We are all those who have been in ruins and thought it would be the end. But it wasn't. Because God specializes in silent rebuilding. He doesn't need a stage. He works in secret, in the depths of our being. And when we realize it, we are now on our feet again, stronger, more sensitive, more alive. Not for us, but for him, for the grace that did not let us sink. Today I look back with respect, not with shame, because that pain taught me to see God with new eyes. It taught me to pray with truth, to walk with faith even when everything still seems unstable. And most importantly, it taught me that God is not impressed by pretty words, but moves before sincere hearts. And that ... changed my story. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The pain became a testimony. And the saddest psalm in the Bible ... became the beginning of my healing. Most people think that faith is something you feel, but I've learned that true faith is something you decide. Because there were days when I felt nothing. No comfort, no presence, no hope. But still, I chose to keep going. My feet kept shaking, but I took one more step. And that's where faith grows. In the dark, in the dry, in the silence. And when I realized I was already stronger than I imagined, not because of visible miracles, but because of an internal miracle, the decision to trust without seeing. Psalm 102 was with me through everything. It became my mirror, my journal, my map. It was as if each line reminded me that I wasn't weak for feeling broken, I was human. And that God doesn't reject those who groan. He listens. He welcomes. He transforms. I began to see the psalm not as a text of despair, but as a sacred confession, a cry authorized by God. Because if God allowed this to be recorded, it is because He wants us to know. We can be honest with Him. And that honesty saved my faith. I tried going to church again. I still felt a bit out of place, but I no longer pretended that everything was fine. When people asked me, "How are you?" I would say, "I'm in process," and I discovered that many other people were too. People who smiled on the outside and fell apart on the inside. And something strong was born there. A community of sincerity, of real support, without masks, without judgment, because those who cry together grow stronger together. And I began to realize, God didn't heal me just for me. He was preparing me to reach others with the same pain. Faith that is born in pain is hard to kill, because it does not depend on sensations. It was forged in fire. And now, even when life tried to knock me down again, I no longer fell like before, because I knew who was holding me up. It was not my strength. It was the hand that never let go of mine, even when I thought I was alone. This awareness became my foundation. I may not have known what would come tomorrow, but I knew who would be with me. And that was enough. That was everything. Enough became a miracle. Today I look at Psalm 102 with reverence, because it didn't give me formulas. It didn't promise me happy endings, but it showed me that it is possible to pray without hope and still be heard. It is possible to be broken and still be loved. It is possible to cry out in pain and still be respected by God. And this possibility opened space for something new in me. Real faith. The one that accepts pain, but is not ruled by it. The one who understands that faith is not the absence of tears. It is choosing to follow, even with wet eyes. The psalmist said, "The peoples will fear the name of the Lord, and all the kings of the earth will fear His glory, when the Lord rebuilds Zion." And I understood. My rebuilding glorifies God too. Because when someone sees you rising from the ashes, they realize it wasn't you. It was Him. And that changes lives. Today I live with scars. But I live. And those scars don't shame me. They're proof that I've been in the valley. But I didn't die there, and if God did this to me, He can do it to anyone. Just cry out. Even without strength, He listens. I thought that in order to give testimony, my life had to be perfect. That I needed a happy ending, complete healing, a bank account in the black and all my problems solved. That the Holy Spirit began to show me otherwise. The strongest testimony is that which is told with scars still fresh, because it doesn't depend on apparent victory, but on real victory. I started talking to people who suffered like I did, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who understands the pain. And I realized, God healed me from the inside first, because that's where everything was broken. It wasn't a pretty process. There were setbacks. There were days when the darkness tried to come back with a vengeance, but now I knew the way. And whenever the pain threatened to paralyze me, I would go back to Psalm 102. I would read it out loud, and I would remember, God did not abandon me in the worst phase of my life. He will not abandon me now either. And that was all I needed to get back up. The faith that was built at rock bottom was now my support when the world tried to pull me down again. It wasn't an emotional faith. It was a rooted faith. People started to come to me. People who had never spoken before, but now said, "I'm like this too. How did you get out of it?" And I would answer, "I didn't get out. God took me out. But it was from the inside out." And I would start to tell them. I would talk about the owl in the ruins, about the bread with ashes, about the tears mixed with water. I would talk about a God who is not afraid of our pain, who enters into it with us. And many people would start to cry right there, because they had never heard anyone talk about faith like that. No filter, no posing, no performance, just real faith. And then I understood. My suffering was not in vain. It was painful, unfair, cruel. But it was not useless, because now it served to reach others. What was once shame, now it was a weapon. A weapon against silence, against loneliness, against the lie that God only loves the strong. I began to see the purpose behind the chaos. And I realized that God does not waste any pain. Everything you give to Him with truth, He transforms. Even your worst phase can become a platform. And not because you won, but because He remained. It was at that moment that I began to pray differently. Before, I asked God to take me out of the pain. Now, I asked Him to use my story. "Lord, if I'm still here, then use this. Turn this valley into a bridge for someone." And He began to do so. Not with crowds, but one by one. People who listened identified with you and said, "You said what I could never put into words." And it was God there, fetching me again. Not for me, but through me. And I felt honored, because being used by God with your own pain is the greatest act of redemption there is. Psalm 102 says, "This will be written for the generation to come, and the people who are created will praise the Lord." And it broke me inside, because that's exactly what it was. That psalm was written for me, thousands of years later. And now my story was being told. To those who have yet to be born from pain, everything connects. Everything makes sense. Everything cooperates. Even if we don't understand it at first, today I know that what I experienced was not the end. It was a calling. The birth of a mission. And when God transforms your pain into purpose, everything changes. I never thought anyone would come to me asking for prayer. I, who could barely pray for myself a while back, would do it. But God has these divine ironies. He transforms former homeless people into guides for those who are lost now. I began to realize that every tear I shed was preparing me to comfort someone. And this is real. It's not theory. It's practice. Because you can only sit with a broken person and listen to them without judgment when you were once one yourself. And that's what became my mission. Not to fix anyone, just to sit with them on the floor. From that moment on, Psalm 102 stopped being just my cure. It became my weapon, my empathy map, my argument when someone said, "God doesn't listen anymore." I would show them, "Look at this. It's right here. Written. God saw the prayer of the helpless and did not despise it." And that broke hearts. Because when a person understands that the Bible recognizes even prayers made in tears, she stops pretending to be strong and starts delivering the truth. It was like that with me. And now I saw it happening to others. The same process, the same pain, the same grace. I began to see a pattern. The more sincere the pain, the faster God showed up. Not with immediate relief, but with an almost palpable presence. His presence changes everything. It doesn't answer every question, but it does answer the main one. "You see me, Lord?" And the answer is always yes. Yes, He sees, He hears, He feels. And this truth, as simple as it may seem, is liberating. Because nothing is more paralyzing than the feeling of being alone in suffering. And when God shows that He is there, everything begins to heal. It was during this process that I realized something else. My faith now had roots. It was no longer that faith of animated worship and ready-made phrases. It was the faith of the battlefield, of the valley, of silence, a faith that survived the collapse. And this gives you authority without having to raise your voice. Only your gaze changes, your posture changes. Because those who have seen rock bottom and come back do not preach with arrogance. Preach with truth, and the truth has weight. It enters the heart of those who listen because it does not come from theory. It comes from pain, from experience, from blood mixed with prayer. I wasn't looking for a stage or a microphone. I just wanted to stay alive and true. But it was in that simple desire that God began to use me more. People would come to me, send me messages, ask for advice. And I would always say, I'm not a therapist. I'm just someone who's been where you are. And that was enough. Because people don't need formulas. He needs witnesses. And I was one. A witness that it is possible to sink and still rise with faith. And this conviction was what gave meaning to everything I had experienced up until then. Today, when I look back, I no longer see a desert. I see a field where God planted deep roots in me. And every tear I shed there became fertilizer. It fed a faith that no one taught me with words. It was pain that taught me. I no longer needed theological arguments. I was the argument. Because surviving with faith, even when broken, is a message that no one can ignore. People listened to what I said, but what really touched them was what I carried in my eyes. A kind of peace that only comes after war. I didn't become a super believer. I still have my crises. I still find myself crying without understanding why. But now I know that all of this is part of it. That true faith is not the absence of instability. It is constancy in instability. And this made me stop comparing myself. Everyone has their own valley, their own dark night, their own choked prayer. What matters is what we do with it. Whether we surrender or harden ourselves, whether we scream or pretend. I chose to scream. And God heard me. And since then, I have never stopped speaking to Him sincerely. Psalm 102 continued to be my refuge. Even after so many readings, it still told me new things. It was as if each phase of my life had a new lens through which to see those words. And what had once been pain was now memory. Sacred. Painful, yes, but also necessary. Because without it, I would not have a voice for those who suffer today. Pain gave me the vocabulary to talk about the broken, and it gave me the authority to calmly say, "You're going to get out of this hole." Because I did, and it wasn't quick. It wasn't easy, but it was real. I realized that God rebuilt my life the way He rebuilds cities in ruins, little by little, carefully, without rushing, stone by stone. And this taught me to be patient with others too. Because not everyone is going to get better in a week. Sometimes all you need is someone to say, "I'm here." And that's what I started to be. Not a problem solver, but a companion on the journey. And that is worth more than 1,000 sermons. Because presence heals. And if God healed my soul with presence, I could do the same for someone else. There was a moment when I realized that I no longer defined myself as someone who suffers. I was someone who lives, who moves on, who witnesses. Pain was part of my story, but it is no longer the title. Now the title is Grace, because it was grace that sustained me when I had no more prayer. It was grace that embraced me when no one knew what to say. And it was grace that lifted me up with strength when everything said I was going to die inside. Grace was my new beginning. And when grace comes in, everything changes. Even without noise. Even without an audience. Psalm 102 ends by talking about God's eternity. And that struck me. Because it's as if it was saying, everything passes. Except Him. And that was the truth I decided to tattoo on my soul. The pain passed. The crisis passed. Even my old understanding of God passed. But He remained the same. The same God who saw me in ashes now sees me in reconstruction. And this reconstruction will not stop here. Because now I live for this. To show that his presence is real. And that even on the saddest days, he is there. There came a point where I stopped trying to understand the reason for my pain. Not because I gave up, but because I understood that the purpose was greater than the explanation. God didn't give me a clear why, but he gave me a deep what for. I went through all of that to be able to say with truth that he does not abandon anyone. It doesn't matter how deep you've sunk, how silent you've been, how far you've distanced yourself. If you're still breathing, it's because his presence is still near. And that changes everything. Not just for me, but for whoever listens to me today. I have begun to testify where before I had only broken down. And the difference is clear. Now the words come out with weight, not with despair. With certainty, not with anxiety. Because I have seen God's faithfulness not in times of celebration, but in times often my soul seemed in ruins. And it is in these moments that you know who God really is. Not the God of slogans, but the God who enters the hole with you, who listens to you without filter, who responds in silence, who does not disappear when the crisis hits. And this shaped me. It broke me, and then remade me with a kind of faith that is not borrowed from anyone. I began to pray for people in a way I had never done before. With tears, with vivid memories, with authority, because I knew what it was like to be in their shoes. I knew the weight of silent pain. I knew the value of a presence that doesn't demand anything, just stays. And so I became that, a reflection of what God was to me. Presence, listening, truth, no beating around the bush, no ready-made phrases, just heart. And that's how I discovered ministry that is born at rock bottom. The ministry of empathy. You don't learn this from books. You only learn it in the mud. Returning to Psalm 102 after all, this was like finding an old scar. You touch it, and it doesn't hurt anymore. But it reminds you of where it came from. And it shows you how much you've grown. That psalm is still sad, raw, painful. But now I can see the light in it. Because it doesn't end in darkness, it ends with promise, with rebuilding, with God's eternity being exalted above human weakness. And that made me stronger. Because if his eternity is real, then my pain is not the end of the story. She's just a chapter. And maybe that's what I most need to tell those who are listening to me today. Your pain is not your identity. It is a part of your journey. But it has no power to define who you will be. God still writes, still transforms, still rebuilds. And if he did it with me, he can do it with anyone. Because I am not special. I was just sincere. And this sincerity connected me with mercy. And it is this connection that moves me today, sustains me, transforms me daily. God is not finished with me. He has only just begun. Now, every time I pray for someone, I carry within me a certainty. I am praying with the one who has overcome with me. Because God did not take me away just to show me love. He took me away, so that others would see his love through me, And that is bigger than any answer I ever wanted before. Today I no longer cry out for explanations. I cry out for more of the presence. Because it was the presence that sustained me when nothing else worked. And it is the presence that will sustain me until the end. Until my last breath. And even after that. I never imagined that that version of me, lying on the floor, with no desire to live, would one day become an answer for someone. That's exactly what God did. He didn't take me out of the valley just to comfort me. He took me out to lift me up like a bridge. A bridge between those who are falling and the one who still gets up. And today I know, my ministry was born from my most desperate moment. It wasn't with a microphone. It was with tears. It wasn't on an altar. It was in a dark room. And that's why it has roots. Because it doesn't depend on applause, only on presence. Every time I tell people what I went through, I see a mixture of shock and relief in their eyes. Shock because they never imagined I went through that. Relief because they realize they are not alone. And that is the secret. The enemy only wins where there is silence. But when we speak, when we expose, when we share, the shame breaks, and the light enters. And where there is light, healing begins. That's what I learned. That bearing witness is not about showing off victory. It is about showing that the war existed, and that God did not run away from the battlefield. Many people think that ministry is about preaching beautifully, singing well, and leading crowds. But the greatest ministry is sitting down with someone and saying, "I understand you." And when that phrase comes with truth, it heals. Because it carries history. It bears marks. And these marks are proof that God still heals, still raises, still restores. It doesn't matter if it was yesterday or 10 years ago. What matters is that you didn't die in pain. You went through it with God. And now you are a living reminder of that to the world. Psalm 102 says that He looked down from His sanctuary. From heaven the Lord looked down to the earth. This moves me to this day, because it proves that even from up there, God sees down here. He sees the suffering. He sees the affliction. He sees the prayer that is choked. And more than just seeing, He answers. Not always with the answer we want, but with the answer we need. In my case, He didn't erase the pain all at once, but He entered into it with me. He strengthened me within it. And little by little, He transformed it into a testimony. And that is more powerful than any instant deliverance. Today, pain is part of my spiritual curriculum. It has taught me things that no course could teach me. It has given me a kind of faith that does not depend on emotion, but on conviction. And that conviction says, God is faithful, even when everything falls apart. And now that I know this faithfulness in practice, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not even for the good years I lived before. Because now I carry something that can't be bought or imitated. The authority of someone who has gone through it and overcome it. And not alone, but sustained by the hand of God. I am no longer afraid of suffering again. Not because I am insensitive, but because I know where to stand if the storm comes again. And it may come again. But now I know, my foundation is not in my mood, nor in my understanding. It is in God. And He doesn't change. He doesn't fail. He doesn't back down. That's what I learned. And that's what I teach now. Not with catchphrases, but with truth. The same truth that one day took me out of the depths of the pit and brought me here. Alive, standing tall, and ready to fulfill what He dreamed for me. This isn't the kind of testimonial that ends with a little background music, and and then everything worked out. Because real life isn't like that. You have good days and days when everything seems to go right. But the difference now is that I know where I am anchored. The pain that destroyed me yesterday makes me stronger today, because I no longer control myself. I no longer live by the expectations of others. I live by the presence of God. And this presence did not abandon me when no one else did. It was faithful. Faithful when I did not deserve it. Faithful when I no longer believed in anything. Psalm 102 started out as my lament, but today it is my memorial. It reminds me of where God brought me from. It marks the exact point where I stopped pretending to be strong and started seeking truth. It was the first place I understood that God does not reject the broken. He embraces. He rebuilds. He writes new stories with those who can only give up broken pieces. And I am proof of that, because I had nothing left to give. Only pain. Only doubt. Only tiredness. But that was exactly what God used as the raw material for my reconstruction. I died inside, yes. And if you've ever been through that, you know it's worse than any physical pain. It's when you're alive, but you don't feel anything anymore. When you breathe, but you don't see any meaning. When you wake up and just want the day to end. But God entered that inner death and said, "It's not over yet." And when He says that, it doesn't matter how big the hole is. He creates ground where before there was only abyss. He creates light where before there was only darkness. And He creates a new identity when the old one has been destroyed by pain. Today I live with purpose. Not perfect, but real. And real is what heals. I don't want to be an example of unshakable faith. I want to be an example of someone who fell, crawled, but didn't let go of God's hand. Because that is true faith. Continue even while bleeding. Keep praying even when you don't feel anything. Believe even when your mind screams that it's useless. And see, after all, that God never lost control. He allowed the process. He remained silent. And then, He rewrote everything. If I could look into your eyes right now and say just one sentence, it would be this: don't give up yet. It may be dark, heavy, impossible, but God is there. You may not see it. You may not even feel it. But He is there. And He sees you. He heard even that cry for help that you never said out loud. And if you keep going, even if it's just one more step, just one more breath, He will show you that He still has a plan. There is still life. There is still a future. Because what He started, He finishes. And He's not done with you. I am the same person who once wanted to disappear. But I am also the one who today says with authority, God heals. God raises. God answers. The saddest psalm in the Bible became the most powerful chapter in my story. And if this happened to me, it can happen to you too. All it takes is a sincere cry, a heartfelt prayer, a surrendered heart. God does the rest. And when He comes in, we are never the same again. I am not, and neither will you be.